Alrighty. Hi everyone, so as Jamie said, I'm Fiyin and I'm the Equity Officer for Council 2020-21 and for the debate tonight. So for us here at Debater, equity is super important because it ensures that everybody has an enjoyable experience. All that we ask is that you don't use any abusive language or slurs, and even though it is virtually we're attending, we ask to please refrain from making any distractions that will take attention away from the speaker. I really hope this debate goes smoothly, and if you encounter any points of concern or any issues, you can anonymously report them using the equity form, which I posted earlier today and will post again in the chat in the Zoom chat. Or you can speak to me personally in the private Zoom chat, which is quite a nice feature, or you can send me a message on Messenger, and I'll do my best to mediate and resolve any issues you have. Last thing to note is that this debate is recorded tonight, so if you don't want to be recorded, if you don't want to view it and record, you can just turn your camera off. Thank you, and I hope you guys enjoy tonight's debate.
Thank you very much for that, Fiyin. The first proposition speaker for the motion, "This House believes that the destruction of property is a valid form of protest," is Helen. You have 5 minutes, beginning now.
Hello, can you all hear me? Yep. Great. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I am proud to propose the motion that stands before the House tonight. Before I get started on my substantive points, let me define something so that we have a nice, clean debate. Protest, for the purposes of this debate, is defined as a statement or action expressing disapproval of or objection to something. This is usually the actions or inactions of government and institutions, but it could also be about societal values or practices as a whole. Recent protests that you might remember include Extinction Rebellion protests, protests against school shootings, Black Lives Matter protests, and women's marches. I'm sure that all the way down the table, many of these will be used as examples. So in my speech tonight, I'm going to talk a bit about law, a bit about history, and a bit about necessity. Let me start with law. The opposition might tell you that the right to owning property is inalienable. What opposition, no one can mess with it. What opposition won't mention is that there are other legal rights that are given to people, including a right to life, a right to self-determination, a right to live a life without being harassed, a right for expression, a right to live free of intimidation by either other individuals or the state. Opposition's burden is to prove that the right to property supersedes protests for these other rights, that it supersedes, that the right to have a Walmart is more important than another person's right to life, okay? I don't think that they'll be able to, because it's a massively high burden that they've given themselves. I think as well that intrinsically society tends to value human lives over persevering property. Let me give you an example. Firefighters, when they turn up to a burning building, their priority is to rescue those inside and keep themselves safe. Yeah, Harry, have a POI?
So you were saying that the right to property can be linked to right to life if it's a part of your livelihood. Many small businesses rely on their property or they're going to starve to death, especially if you come from a poor area.
Okay, thank you. So I think a characteristic of recent protests has been not the destruction of property indiscriminately, but targeted destruction of property. I'm going to talk a bit about history, but generally, when minorities are protesting, they will not target their own communities. They will target multi-billion-pound people or banks. These are people that can afford to take a dip in profits, and these are people that, if their property is destroyed, they will actually pay attention to the matters that are being protested about. Okay, back to my speech. So any reasonable person, I think, would hold a right to life over a right to property, and that is why protesting for a right to life is significantly more important to people than, should Jeff Bezos keep his third yacht, for example? Okay, my second point is on necessity. So protests, they generally don't start by destroying stuff because it knows that it will give them a bad reputation.
Helen has frozen, by the way, Helen, if you're still trying to talk.
Held fundraisers, marches, speeches, they handed out ribbons, but did they start to actually get change? Did the status quo change for the suffragists? It wasn't until suffragettes came along and started to speak with actions, they started to disrupt the way that men did business, they started to damage men's property, that they started to, slash men's paintings, objectifying women, that the status quo began to change. They began to get closer to their goals. It was when the wallets of those upholding the status quo were hit that things started to change, laws were started to pass. It wasn't when people appealed to their common sense, it wasn't when people appealed to their empathy, it wasn't when people appealed, to their compassion. It was when economically they started to take damage, because in a capitalist system, the ruling class has no interest in an individual's rights until needing those individuals' rights, you're out of time, Harry, began to, when protesting for these rights began to hurt their wallets. The last thing I'm going to say is historically this has worked, right? The Tea Party protest and the suffragette movement is a really good example of how protest by destroying property has done things that have improved it. And that is all I have to say. I am proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Helen. Fantastic speech. Right, now we'll move on to the leader of the opposition for the motion. This House believes that the destruction of property is a valid form of protest. Gavin, up to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Helen for that speech, and thank you to everyone for being here tonight. So I'm going to mention quite a few things. I hope you can all hear me, by the way, but I'm going to rebut a couple of things that Helen has said. She said that on this side of the House, what we have to do is prioritise property. Now, I don't believe that we do have to do that, because I believe that when a person's property is destroyed, and I think the people on this side of the House share my view in this, it isn't just a building or a monument that's destroyed. It isn't just it's a person's livelihood. It's an entire community in many cases that can be destroyed. So I don't believe that we have to fit into that narrative on this side of the House. Another thing Helen mentioned, which I found very interesting, she said that, used the example of the suffragettes and how the suffragettes came along and they changed the argument for women's rights. This isn't true, and most historians do not point to the suffragettes as being the reason as to why women gained the vote. They point to women's work during the war, which ultimately led to the Representation of the People Act. That's historians who say that. Now, I will actually rebut that a little bit further and say, at the end of the argument on the proposition side, they say that revolution or violence leads to, a better, more radical outcome. Well, look at the French Revolution. It started with a dictatorship in the monarchy, and it ended with Napoleon Bonaparte. It went through a period of violence in which everyone who didn't agree with the revolution was killed. And then it ended up in another dictatorship. So revolutions don't lead to change in many cases. Indeed, they lead to a completely worse situation, as we've seen. Now, onto the broad brush of what I'm going to say. On this side of the House, we believe fundamentally in the right, indeed the freedom to protest. We believe that vandalisation is a bad thing. We honestly do. And I don't understand how this can be a particularly contentious issue. I mean, obviously, the motion that we're debating tonight is, but you look at the very essence of what we're talking about. We're talking about two things, basically. We're talking about statues and monuments which have been desecrated during the summer. And then we're talking about people's homes, people's businesses, people who in many cases have had absolutely nothing to do with the protests. I mean, just look at the statues and monuments, for example. We had the Bristol monument where there was it was torn down. Now, a lot of people, indeed, I think yesterday I was reading the chairman of Historic England had said that this is not the right way, that this sort of argument can be done, that this kind of argument can be won. I won't say just how, Helen, I'll just make a bit of progress, and then I'll take you. But he said that the way that you do this, the way you have these arguments, is by contextualising the things. You don't destroy the very things that they are. Now, I find this argument particularly difficult, and I think that the proposition is kind of going to struggle to that. And they don't seem to really want to mention, I don't think they will mention much about this. But on our side of the House, this is what we're talking about. because this is ultimately what this debate is about. It is about what has happened this summer. It's about getting to a goal that particularly people want. And by being radical, you don't get to that goal. It's only by being working through democratic means that you can actually achieve things. Indeed, as I've said earlier, when you don't go for democratic means, indeed, it can end in a completely worse outcome than you've already had. Now, think about this. I've mentioned it already, but imagine you're a shop owner. Imagine you have a business in a place like Portland, and you have nothing to do with what's happened in the Black Lives Matter movement at all. You don't have an opinion on it, but you are thrown into it because people believe, and they have a fundamental right to believe in protest. Of course they do. But they shan't take it to the point where they're destroying people's livelihoods. It seems like a very simplistic thing to argue, and it seems like we haven't heard much, and I don't think we will hear much from the proposition side that will be able to counter this. And so I would challenge the proposition and the other free speeches that they've got to do this, to say, look, why is it okay about everything that's happened in June and July and August, that people are simply allowed to do what they like, to roam streets, and if you don't agree with them, then you basically don't fit the mold and you're not allowed to do anything effectively. But I urge you to oppose this motion, not because it's very obvious why you should, but for the decency of democracy, for the decency to defend the rights of what we had and the history that we have currently. So thank you very much. Cheers.
Hi. Thank you very much, Gavin, for another really good speech. Now we'll move on to the second proposition, which is Maxwell. Maxwell, on to you.
So I'd first like to engage in some rebuttal. Gavin talks about businesses being destroyed, yet he promptly goes on to mention monuments being destroyed and not businesses, despite that's what he's talking about. That's because he can't mention any businesses being destroyed on a large scale, because this isn't what has happened in the protests. As a general rule, the Black Lives Matter protests have been about Black Lives Mattering. When they do take the destruction down, it has been monuments, it's been government property, it's been Confederate monuments that specifically institutionalized slavery in the United States. That's a very specific form of protest to blowing up a building. And Gavin hasn't told us why these people have been blowing up buildings and hasn't been able to give us an example, because it hasn't really happened. And therefore, a lot of his argument goes out the window. So I'm going to primarily talk to you about why the democratic options have been tried and failed, and that people are no longer being listened to. So throughout history, the destruction of property has been one of the most common and effective forms of protest. The American Revolution, the suffragettes, the ANC, all practiced the destruction of property because they were otherwise unable to get their protest action through democratic means. They were forced to do these alternatives, and they took them because it's the only way they could get people to listen. This idea does not come from nowhere. The people who are not being listened to have tried before. Massive rallies and protests have been systematically ignored by the government. We've had huge protests about Iraq. We've had huge protests about Brexit, both of which were not only ignored, but they were gone on to do the very thing that people on a large scale were protesting against, who didn't want this to happen as a general rule. And in the case of Brexit, it was worse than what was promised. Despite the fact people have been protesting peacefully about this change, the government has ignored it. So it's unsurprising people have turned to the destruction of property. I see a PY, I will take it.
Well, with Brexit and like the Black Lives Matter and stuff, you're basically saying if you don't get your way, you should behave like ISIS and destroy monuments. It's exactly the same as ISIS, isn't it? If you don't get your way, you're gonna destroy people's houses and property.
Okay,
but the fact
I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
Could you please stop talking, because I have a right to do that. In this case, we're not talking about ISIS, who's like beheading people in Syria, but we are talking about, yes, using violent means to get what you want because the government is repressing you. And that is actually something people are allowed to do. They have a right to self-determination. And if you're being ignored, then the principle of democracy is not being followed. To further this up, in both of those situations, there are public opinions against the current policy. Even if they're not public opinions against Brexit, there are public opinions against hard Brexit. There were public opinions against the Iraq War, and they were ignored. Same with Black Lives Matter. There's been no systematic change, which was why the protest happened in the first place. These people aren't necessarily, these people do not come from a vacuum. They come from a system of systematic repression where their democratic needs are ignored. So when the system in the UK ensures the majority is in favor of a system that perpetuates the ability to just ignore people, when people can't vote in the change they want, what are people to do? They are to try and get the government's attention. Peaceful protests have been tried. So in this case, it is a good idea to destroy property. And it will be primarily government property, because in all of the examples I've listed, it has been primarily government property. Because these are the people who have been oppressing them. Specifically, it's been against the people who have been causing suffering to the individuals we're talking about here, in this case, minority groups. And very much so, because people aren't just mindless animals and desire the change they're looking for, they go after government property. In this case, when a government doesn't listen, it's oftentimes much more likely to listen when destruction of property is involved, because everybody accepts this government cares about property rights and cares about its own property, and thus is much more likely to have media attention and have a concern about these protests when this happens. Take the Black Lives Matter movements. Even though they haven't been systematically destroying property, it's just not something that's happened, they've still had massive coverage because there's been destruction of monuments, because it's been much less peaceful than the previous protests. And not saying that individuals are they're inciting violence, but frankly, there's been police violence and there's been responses. When there's more of this property destruction, you have more of a response, you have more ideas of this in the public sphere, and therefore you have more of a consideration, and it actually is more likely to result in democratic rights when this happens. Thank you.
Time, Maxwell. Thank you very much. Very good speech. Thank you very much. And now we'll move on to the second opposition speaker. Ethan, you got 5 minutes. Are you here? Yes. Starting now.
So the first point, I just want to quickly make in terms of statues. So the destruction of statues as a form of protest is sort of predicated on the idea that a statue glorifies everything about an individual, which I think is a deeply flawed idea, simply because, generally speaking, when people have been given a statue, it's because of some notable achievement. Now, a lot of people had bad views historically, because frankly, that's simply how things were for a lot of history in terms of historical context. You know, even like 50 years ago, 100 years ago, the fact is, there is a clear social progress in views, and there's always going to be views that, you know, seem perfectly reasonable at the time, that with historical hindsight, we can see that we're wrong. And I think the great example that sort of shows, you know, statues don't glorify anything is, of course, Lord Nelson. So, of course, very famous adulterer, Lord Nelson. But if you go to London, you see Trafalgar's column. It doesn't. I don't think anyone's ever felt an urge to cheat on their wife or their girlfriend or their husband, you know, because they saw a statue of Nelson. My point being that a statue doesn't glorify everything about a person. It glorifies the good that they did. Bad views were pretty standard, but I think we should leave those up because of effectively the good that people have done, and it doesn't glorify the whole point. And the second thing, sorry, I can't take that just because I lost a bit of time in the beginning. The second point I'd like to make is on change in terms of what Helen talked about. So I'd like to use the example of climate change to show that actually you don't need, you know, in terms of serious protests. And I believe that's one of the, I'm not sure, I believe you used the example. But in terms of the climate change protest, right? So recently we had like Extinction Rebellion, you know, we've had, of course, the mass protests in London and all around the country. But frankly, a lot of these protesters were pretty ignorant of, you know, the way things were before. And so, for instance, if we look at the Environmental Performance Index, now the UK is currently ranked fourth in the EPI, and 11th in the GCEI. It's another international measure. If you look over the last 10 years, and again, I remember going down to these protests and speaking to these people, and they were saying, oh, well, we haven't been doing anything these last 10 years. And I was trying to tell them, well, if you look at the last 10 years, long before the protests, the system was changing, but it simply changed quietly, so no one noticed. So again, using the EPI, we were ranked 6th in the 2018. That's, again, before Extinction Rebellion, 12th in 2016. I think we went up a bit from 9th, but effectively, the point is, for a long time, the system has gradually developed that we've been able to tackle climate change and we've become a climate leader, but people aren't aware of it. It was done very quietly, and therefore, well, I guess the point I'm making is that you don't need protests which damage property in order to achieve change. Change is achieved by the system. It's achieved through capitalism, but it's achieved in a way that isn't noticeable. And then the final point two other points I'd like to make. One is in terms of when violence does get out of control, it is Helen claimed that it wasn't, it's not indiscriminate. Well, I'm afraid it really was indiscriminate, because when it's controlled, maybe it's early, that's fine, but with a lot of these situations, what happens is it gets out of control, and therefore small businesses do get damaged. Yeah, all right, cheers. And again, the final point I'd like to make is in terms of banks and big businesses being damaged. Now the fact is, when these are damaged, it's got repercussions for everyone, and of course you can argue about obviously I'm not saying that the argument is not about whether Jeff Bezos has another jet. The point is that in terms of banks, in terms of government property, government departments, whatever you want to call it, because the previous speaker brought up the point of government property. Government property and banks, in terms of the system, is essential to the functioning of society, and so without them, really, society collapses. Thank you for your time, and I beg you to oppose the motion.
Thank you very much, Ethan. Really good speech. We'll move on to the third proposition speaker of the night, which is Dasha. You have 5 minutes starting now.
Okay, so protests have a unifying nature which helps people to represent their ideas as one and fight for their rights as one, because fighting unitedly is something that prevents us from becoming apathetic and thoughtless. There will be 3 main points in my speech, 2 if I run out of time. First is a more instrumental regarding how we need to fight fire with fire. Second is regarding how our capitalist society needs to be changed through destruction of property and protests. And the third one will be more general revolutionist points, but a little bit of rebuttal. So statues are symbols of oppression, regardless of what good people have done for whom we made those statues. They could have done something good for the country in general. However, if there are negative connotations with them, they will remain as symbols of oppression for those people who have suffered under the... I'm not taking any questions in this speech. It will remain as a symbol of oppression towards those people who have suffered under the hands of those people. And this is not something we want to stay, because we are a modern society, and in order to build a better future for ourselves, we have to destroy the past. And second point is regarding how we protest, but the things are changing. The things aren't changing enough, and they aren't changing fast enough. And this is why we are protesting, because we all have a limited amount of time on this earth. And in order for us to have a better future for ourselves and for our children, we have to take action now. So on to my first point. When does destruction of property happen? When nice words don't work anymore. Peaceful marches do not bring us the result that we are looking for, and they are very often met by more violence from the side of the party that we are protesting against. Take a look at the BLM movement which we were talking about. the amount of police brutality that was happening as a result of the peaceful protests, all of the tear gas, all of the beatings on the streets. This is not something that we want. And since this is what the government is doing and this is what the oppressive side is doing, we have to respond in the same manner in order to be heard and in order to achieve some form of result. This has to be countered with the same ferocity and tools. We do not support burning down houses with people still in them to kill them, no. But we do support causing damage to buildings of officials or taking apart roads to inconvenience people. Take, for example, the Ukrainian protests in 2014, the Maidan. We took apart cobblestone streets so that people wouldn't be able to use the roads. We attacked the parliament building, we vandalized it, and we destroyed the police buildings. The nation as one was showing that it does not support whatever the government is doing, and it was showing it with violence because this was the only way that they would be heard, that they would be seen by the international community and by the government of the state itself. Because when people were just peacefully standing on the streets or in the main square of the city, the government would just bring in police and would disperse the crowd, and that just wasn't working and no change was happening. And once the protests turned somewhat violent, this is when the actual change has happened. Now, and some collateral damage will happen, unfortunately, because this is how fires work, they just spread around. But we have an idea, we have something that we want to achieve, we want a better future for ourselves, and we have to take every step possible in order to achieve that. Second point, most of our social problems, such as pay gap, extreme poverty, workplace discrimination, all come from the capitalist worldview that we have, and it has been normalized in our society. Money and property rule over everything. It is seen as more important than human lives, and this is not something we stand for. And in order to somehow show to this capitalist society, which values property so much, we have to destroy the property. It is that easy and it is that symbolic. Destruction of property is a tangible instrument of showing society's distaste with capitalism and also a method to hit where it hurts the most. So, to summarize our points, when there is an oppressive element in the society, it has to be fought against with its own instruments. And if the instrument of the oppressor is violence, it has to be fought back with violence in order to achieve an actual result and in order to change our society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fantastic speech yet again, Dasha. Well done. Now we move on to the third opposition speaker of the evening, which is Harry. Harry, you got 5 minutes starting now.
All right, sure. So I'll make this brief, but I'll be quick. First of all, I'd like to point out everything Dasha said, everything's in the complete reverse. Because, you know, the big billionaire corporations are the ones funding militant terrorist groups like Black Lives Matter and Antifa. These are the people responsible for our plight. These are the people attacking our culture and our traditions. These are the people that are using minorities as a scapegoat to target and destroy average middle-class families and destroy their businesses. You have to remember, powerful billionaires like George Soros, for example, gave $600 billion to the Black Lives Matter campaign, despite the fact that the Black Lives Matter board has Rosenberg, a known terrorist, on the FBI's most wanted list inside its membership. She was known for smuggling bombs and she aided in a terror attack that led to 2 dead police officers. And, you know, people talk about her society's oppressive this, but the truth is, yes, society is oppressive, but it's oppressive in the liberal far left way. The most oppressed group today is the average right-wing man, whichever country you go to. Like, you know, these are the most oppressed group in society. And instead, you know, we are blamed for everything. And, you know, our birthright is taken away to accommodate, what do you call it, everyone else. You know, you're blamed for everything, you didn't do anything, and then, oh, geez, I'll take the thing later, we'll do question time later. So yes, and that's my first point. Secondly, you have to understand, despite being funded by billionaire corporations, these groups are a front for far-left cultural Marxism. These are fronts for a violent communist revolution, just like in communist China when they went around destroying temples, scrolls, ancient statues, and they went around persecuting people with aristocratic surnames in the name of equality. They went around mutilating the faces of pretty people in the name of equality. In end, it was a complete and utter moment of moral degeneration and a race to the bottom. And this is the same thing that's going on now. And the reason I mentioned ISIS before is because they go around destroying classical statues as well, which they did in Syria, in the city of Palmyra. Secondly, what do you call it? These statues have a cultural, historical value. Should we go around destroying the Colosseum, statues of Roman emperors, the pyramids, the golden statue of Genghis Khan because they killed people or owned slaves? No, I don't think so. And I've been in Turkey for holiday, and I remember they even had a street named after Barbarossa, who was a mass slave. He was involved in the European slave trade and was a famous pirate, but I don't see anyone demanding Turkey destroy their streets. It's only forcefully applied on Western nations. And, to Maxwell's point, Maxwell goes on about how great he is because he agrees with these far left groups. However, half of us hate these far left groups and don't want any of this forced down our throats. And, imagine if it was the other way around. Imagine if right-wingers went around smashing shops and windows of, liberal businesses and went around harassing people in the street, The news would have a fit and we'd all be persecuted and arrested. It's only allowed because it's done by the far left. And as for the police violence, the police were not violent first at these riots. The rioters were trying to throw things at them, shine lasers in their eyes, try to blind them, try to stab them. And when the police retaliated, they cried foul at a fight they picked. So anyone want the question? Wait a sec. If anyone wants to do question time now, I'll take it. Sorry, it's just, I'm trying to open Zoom, but yeah. Sorry. So if anyone wants to ask, Dasha, you had a POI, didn't you? Yeah, you can talk. Oh.
You're actually out of time, Harry. You have about 50 seconds left. They can't.
Oh, right. So there goes my point.
Okay, is that your speech done?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Harry, for that speech. We'll move on to the final proposition speaker for the night, which is Jack. Yes, Jack, you have 5 minutes starting now.
Right, so there's a lot of stuff to get into. However, my main points of clash are to do with history, or to do with law, or to do with community, and to do with historical bandmen. However, I think there's quite a lot of rebuttal to go into, and I think so. Firstly, I think that I'm going to go a little bit off track here, and something that's not particularly relevant to the debate. But the idea, I think the idea that the right-wing middle-class white man is somehow the most, the working-class white man is the most oppressed being on this earth is, I think, frankly a fallacy, considering that quite a lot of these protests are about modern day racial modern day discrimination that is very tangible against minorities by either institutes of the state, mainly by arms of the state, such as the police. So, for example, one of the things I'm going to be talking about later on in my speech is the London riots, which were triggered by the shooting of an unarmed black man in North London by the Metropolitan Police. I think that you can't. I think the idea that I don't think it's even worth dealing with the whole kind of Soros weird the Soros anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that we've been getting out of the opposition, the member of opposition speech. However, so firstly, However, firstly, I'm going to go into my main vote. So, firstly, in terms of history, I think that you need. I think that if you have a statue there, that's in the street for all to see, like for example, the one of Edward Colston in Bristol, or the one in Cecil Rhodes, both in Cape Town and in Oxford, you're leaving them there to like think them as great men when obviously they did what we regard now to be bad things, and that needs to be remembered. That these are like symbols of oppression. So say for example, the Rhodes Must Fall campaign of 2015 and 2016, which where students in universities across the world campaigned to take down various statues of Cecil Rhodes. So like he was adjudged in his time to be a racist. He was judged in his time to be someone who held held views that were not particularly appropriate for the turn of the 20th century. So therefore, when you're looking at him and say, oh yeah, he was a great man and did all these scholarships for like people in the Commonwealth to go to the University of Oxford, he's still a racist who is being glorified in universities in universities and cities across the globe. That's why campaigns like Rhodes Must Fall exist. That's why because these are still symbols of oppression. And that rebellion is always against either a symbol of oppression or an institution of oppression. Secondly, I think that in terms of the destruction of property, again, as we saw in the 2011 London riots, is that quite a lot of the destruction of that businesses were corporations that could afford to take the hit. Like say, like a random branch of Domino's in Tottenham isn't going to necessarily. That's not going to destroy the livelihood of the worldwide corporation of Domino's. And I think that the idea that these target like random middle class business owners is frankly a fallacy. I don't think it does. Like for example, it doesn't just like the looting either in Portland or in St. Louis or back in London in 2011 wasn't against their own. It wasn't against the business owners in these areas. It was against corporations in the corporations in those areas were targeted. It was chains that were targeted. People that could afford to take the hit. Secondly, I think rights. We think on site government that rights are important, and that there are rights that trump the right to private property, which does exist. But we think there are like the right to live a peaceful life free from oppression, whether that be by the state, whether that be by corporations, whether that be by institutions. That is a right that people have an inalienable right to have, more so than the right to like own a business, or the right to like have, or the right to like own a house or something. We don't think that that's more important than being able to live your life free from institutional oppression. Therefore, you should be able to exact whatever means you can to be able to live a life free from institutional oppression. And that's why you should vote for side government today.
Thank you very much for that speech, Jack. Now that concludes the proposition side of the table. We have one more speech to conclude the opposition side, which is Robert, who is, thank you very much for stepping in about an hour ago. Thank you very much. All right, we'll give you 5 minutes now. Robert.
Okay, go. So, firstly, I don't agree with anything that Harry said. I think he used many racist dog whistles, including anti-Semitic ones. I would like to point out that if the people who are big businesses are in fact trying to influence society, they'd be able to do that anyway without funding these protests, because they are the society, they build it, they profit from it, they are in the interest of keeping the status quo. And I also think that talking about monuments is kind of dumb, because monuments are not hurting people standing up, and they're not hurting people lying in rivers. So either way, meh. What I do want to talk about is I want to focus in on this issue of destruction of property as destruction of livelihoods, and focus, and like the others, side proposition has been talking a lot about like how there's no alternatives and how peaceful process doesn't get it done. So I want to show other ways of doing this. And we're going to take this in
bit of a strange order. So firstly, let's touch on something that Dasha said when she took on a bit of a Marxist point of view. And she said that the destruction of property is a primary fight against capitalism, because capitalism is about private property. And we don't dispute this. We know that capitalism is about private property. But we'd like to say that there are other ways to disrupt that, and namely strikes. And large general strikes are generally more effective. That is what was used in Germany in the interwar years to force leftist change, and that worked very well. Whereas destruction of property can only work on small scales, right? Because you can only destroy so many of the individual businesses or things, whereas when you have a general strike, when you have a thing, that can be greater impact. Secondly, this is sort of bringing in something Jack said. I'd like to, Jack used an example of the destruction of McDonald's and Tottenham's not having an effect on McDonald's as a corporation. And we see this is entirely true. But what does the destruction of McDonald's in Tottenham actually do? Well, it does have an effect on the person who owned that McDonald's franchise, who is not a billionaire, who is not rich. And it has an effect on everyone who's working at that McDonald's franchise, which are probably several people. And they all lose their livelihoods, whereas McDonald's gets to sail by almost scot-free. Whereas if you had the people in that establishment striking, that would actually be an effect on the McDonald's losing out, and those people would be in on the action, they would be included in the protests, they would feel more class solidarity, and they would not feel like they had something stripped away from them. So that would be a better way of doing it. We think that this does expand, as a lot of my colleagues talked about, to private business owners and things. And we think that they're also likely to form a basis, the middle class business owner is going to form a basis of being anti these protests in a big political arena, because they feel endangered by this destruction of property. So we think by refraining from the destruction of property, you then help get them on side, you also appear more sympathetic, you don't appear as violent, and that is good for your protest overall. But that's just reasons it should be done. The reason that it's actually illegitimate is because it damages livelihoods, as we said. And secondly, we think that it was posited that this was the only way to cause mass change, but we don't think this is true, because we think mass change comes from disruption of society. And sure, destruction of property is one way to disrupt society, but there are also plenty of other ways. Extinction Rebellion has been very good at this, of using non-violent methods like lying down in roads. Gandhi managed to do it with the salt marches and all those sorts of things. Those are very non-violent ways to disrupt property. And we think those are all great. And finally, we think that there is actually a thing that does invalidate this, right? Because protest, as defined by Helen, was about any sort of societal grievance people had, taking it out. And we don't think these societal grievances are always going to be beneficial, to be taken out, because we think that entire societies can be discriminatory against groups, and we think that by saying the destruction of property is a valid form of protest, someone could protest the fact there is a religious minority within their country by destroying their businesses, right? And we don't think that would be valid. We don't think that is an avenue that should be open to people. And so, because we think that this will directly harm, this is a form of protest that directly harms people, there are disruptive measures that are less harmful, and because and because there are disruptive measures that are less harmful, we think that this isn't a valid form of protest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's his time. Thank you very much, Robert. Fantastic. Now, that is both sides of the debate concluded. For this House believes that the destruction of property is a valid form of protest. Now we are going to move on to floor speeches. These are 2 minutes long. I will give you a message at 1 minute on the side chat bar. 3 minutes. 2 minutes. 3 minutes. They are 3 minutes long. I will give you a thanks, Jan. Thank you, Jan. I will give you a message at 1 minute and a message at 10 seconds. And yes, we go in the order of proposition, so agreeing with the motion, opposition, disagreeing with the motion, and then on the side of abstention, which is either just a comment or a not concluded side of the argument. So, who would like to go first? Oh, either message in the chat or do the little wave icon if you have anything you want to say. So we'll go proposition round 1. Anybody? No? Okay. Right, we'll go on to a floor speech for opposition. Opposing the motion, this House believes that the destruction of property is a valid form of protest. Derek Gardner, I'd like to speak. Yes, okay. Derek, if you turn your microphone and camera on, where are you? Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Derek. We'll give you 3 minutes starting now.
Right, so let's just look at the practical impact of destroying property. Does it go anywhere to achieving the aims that the protesters want to achieve? Well, my answer would be no. It only causes things to get worse. So, for instance, if you look at the pulling down of the Edward Colston statue or the attempted pulling down of other statues, what does that actually achieve in practical terms? Well, it doesn't improve the standard of living for anybody. It doesn't reduce the police's likelihood of brutality against protesters. It doesn't make any material difference other than that there is one less statue in a city square in Bristol that you don't have to walk past during the day. So it's not achieving the aims of the protesters. Also, it makes them look like violent criminals, and that's not going to gather public support. That's going to turn the public against them, because most of the public are in favour of raising awareness through peaceful means. So the past, as one of the speakers who said the past needs to be destroyed, I would certainly dispute that, because I think the past is there for us to learn lessons from. And one of the lessons we can learn from the past, in particular the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, is that when things get violent and when the other side takes power, they often use violence on the people they don't like. So it's a perpetual cycle of violence, and it doesn't stop with the destruction of a few buildings. It goes on to the destruction of people, of lives. And you start by burning books and you stop by burning people, is how the saying goes. Now, also another thing I would point out is that many on the proposition side would be selective as to the protests that they choose to support. How would they react if, for instance, the anti-lockdown protests we saw in Trafalgar Square a couple of weeks ago turned violent? Because they don't agree with them, would they be on the side of the police suppressing that violence, or would they be on the side of the protesters who were destroying property in the name of anti-lockdown? So it's best just to, because it's not exclusive to your side destroying buildings, the other side as well can start destroying buildings. So that's why it's best not to cross that line. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek, for that speech. Right now we move on to the abstention side. So this is a for or against. Jan, yes. Yeah, cool. Okay, Jan, you have 3 minutes for an abstention speech. Okay, starting now.
Okay, cool. I would like to address a few points that Harry has made, and then afterwards I'm gonna explain some more general stuff, and then I say why nonetheless I don't believe that destroying property is necessarily an effective strategy. But first, a couple of points I would like to address. So we heard this point that in Turkey there are statues for slave traders, and nobody does anything about that. And quite frankly, that's whataboutism. That's sort of this far-right talking point that was espoused by people like Dennis Prager at CancelCon. So if people are hanging out too much in these spaces, I guess that's the argument you take away, where you said, oh, nobody complains in Brazil about Bolsonaro, which is literally not true. These are just independent struggles, but we are in the West, so we are debating about sort of these Western issues. So quite frankly, that's whataboutism. Then sort of the Antifa government-funded talking point again. I think people need to get out of their NRX headspaces and stop reading Nick Land, and then they will move away from these kind of points. Because sadly, I can say that after all of these Antifa demonstrations, I've never been able to collect a single paycheck, unfortunately. So there you go. Okay, then on to some more general points. Why do people destroy property? So we've heard that usually people destroy property when a situation has been escalated to a point where people see no other alternative. And that often gets escalated by police action as well. When you have violent protests, these protests usually turn violent when the police turns violent. We have multiple case studies there. One of them is the G20 protest. You can read it all in the book called The End of Policing. It's really great. It's a collection of different cases where that takes place, right? Similar thing with crime, right? Crime is only a means to sort of marginalize people. The criminal justice system is usually only there to oppress people that have been marginalized by society. And to determine what is legitimate and what is illegitimate always comes from the people that have the power and not the people that do not have the power, and therefore resort to this kind of violence, right? There are actually more points that I would like to address, but I don't have time. Nevertheless, what I want to say is that I don't think it's a particular effective strategy because, to speak with the words of Slavoj Žižek, he says that when people are criticizing and demonstrating against the system, against capitalism, then they relatively quickly fall back into their capitalist consumerist mindset. So the only solution they have is looting stores, which is not particularly effective, right? So what would be a better strategy is to actually seize the private property and democratize it, right? That would be way better, that would serve way more people, and that would not alienate people that have done nothing wrong. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much, Jan, for returning to grace us with a really great floor speech. Okay, so that is Jan, thank you very much. Now we'll move back for a second round of floor speeches. We'll begin with a proposition speech, 3 minutes long, in favour of the motion. Anybody keen? Either message the chat or do the little emoji wave, or Fiyin. Yes, Fiyin. You have 3 minutes starting now.
Fantastic. Right. This was a debate that I purposefully chose to take a step back because I understand the kind of content that could come out, and I'm happy that I did. To start with, if the destruction of, let's focus on statues firstly, because there's been all this talk about, oh, statues they're taking down. Discussion around these statues only started coming up when people started bringing up the problematic values that they represented. My argument is, put those statues in a museum. We've been leaving them out there for pigeons to poop on them. We've disregarded them. We haven't thought about them. So people have brought up the reason that they shouldn't exist. Fine. Why is there no argument to put them in museums? Secondly, we've not actually talked about the destruction of property as in like corporate property, so like bodies that it took for a lot of these monuments that people are pulling down to be achieved. So a lot of people's bodies were destroyed in order for a lot of things, monuments, statues, and things like that to go up. Like focusing on the stuff that's BLM related, because that's come up so much. And nobody's talked about the destruction of that property and how people haven't been recompensated for that. And then there was this idea that, oh, if we give power to the people who are oppressed, they'll just do the same thing that, you know, we did to them, to us. They'll do the same thing back to us. I don't see women burning down things. I don't see, like, when minorities or other groups achieve equality in places, I don't see them burning things down and, like, doing the same thing back. I see them contributing further to society. I see when that space is created for them, they're actually giving back to society and not just like doing the same thing back to those who oppress them, which is a very interesting fear. Now, the point of my speech is this debate was quite here and there. And the reason I probably should have gone in abstention because of all the things I've said, but I think the main point is that, like, within each, if we go case by case in terms of why property has been destroyed in different types of riots and things, it's been for different reasons. Again, if I'm going to focus on the BLM matter, because that came up a lot of people felt like the reparations that should have occurred after the American Civil War didn't to an adequate amount. So a lot of people feel like they are owed as taxpayers now, and it has people who haven't been recompensated to the property they're destroying, if they're even destroying property. And I think excellent points about the fact that it's government property, they're not going after private owners. And then just really quickly, because I have 1 minute left, there was, Jack brought up a point about how if a franchise is destroyed, you know, the people within that franchise, no, the franchise, the whole company itself is not affected, but and then Robert rebutted really well with the fact that, you know, obviously the franchise, the person who owns the franchise loses his job, those people lose their job. Well, those people have most likely have a welfare system to catch them. They will have a way to survive that process. Those who are being oppressed carry on being oppressed in regards. So I think that's just a little rebuttal thing. But anyway, yeah, that's the speech. There's just a few things I had to say. Didn't have too much time to say them. That was really unorganized. But yeah, that's it.
And that's his time. Thank you very much, Fiyin. So we now move to another opposition floor speech against the motion. If anyone wants to give a 3-minute speech or even just a comment about anything, raise your hand now or do the emoji or message the chat. Once, twice, 3 times, okay. And we've got an abstention speech from George. Okay, George. We'll give you 3 minutes for an abstention speech starting now.
Wonderful. Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Good. I'd like to speak in abstention because speaking in favour of or against the motion wouldn't really add to the debate. We need to contextualise this. But also because I want to act as witness in how we can sympathise and seek to understand and address the cause of these protests whilst refraining from encouraging or engaging in violence. I also want to answer one of the questions that Jan briefly touched on. Why do we consider tearing down of Edward Colston to be a moral and righteous act, whilst the looting and destruction of small business we saw in the August riots that Jack talked about is seen as immoral and selfish from the part of the protesters? And I think I'd actually want to speak on for a silent majority of ordinary people who do care, who deeply care about the injustices and persecution we see in our society, but unwilling to endorse violence in the name of justice. And that extends to impersonal violence, such as the destruction of property. Dasha illustrated this in reference to the Maiden in Ukraine. Many people hold that violence and injustice are incompatible. Gavin and Ethan talked about approaching these problems with democracy and within the system. That ignores the very source of these protests we've seen this summer, the disenfranchisement of the voiceless. We need to acknowledge that we are in this society socially and politically where there's such a deep, uncrossable divide where all sides, and trust me, there's more than 2 sides to these stories, where all sides seem to be unable to comprehend, accept, or emphasize those from a different background. We are in this because our current system fails to represent or even listen to working class people. Maxwell, thankfully, did briefly touch on the political failures which lead to such protests. If citizens are not served with a government that they proportionally voted for, they will lose their faith in the system, they will lose their faith in parliamentary democracy, and will turn to other means to make their voices heard. Violent protest by the mob is never cruel or cold destruction of life and society, the kind we see from governments. It is a cry of hot pain, a cri de coeur from the voiceless, from the disenfranchised and the dispossessed. We can embrace the immediate righteous anger that protesters have, but it needs to be forged into a constructive, progressive action and not destructive violence. As I said, many people do not believe that violence and justice that is being sought are actually compatible. So therefore, we need to act for justice whilst avoiding violence, and that's why I've abstained. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George, for the abstention speech. Right, we'll try one more round. See how this goes. This will be the final round. So any final comments for the night, you're ready to make them. We'll start first with a proposition floor speech. So in favour of the motion. Anyone? No? Then we'll move to an opposition one. No? Okay. And we will move to an abstention. Any more abstentions? No? Okay, well done, George. You had the last word of the night. There you go. Right, so we're going to move to a vote. I think if everyone can turn their camera on, if they can, to raise their hand for this point. If not, just do an emoji reaction in the corner. Ross and Matthew here will go through, and the three of us will count, and the three of us will not vote either. So, yes. Okay. We will go through. So, all in favour of the motion, this House believes that the destruction of property is a valid form of protest. Please raise your hands or make a noise. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
George, raised hand?
George hasn't got a raised hand though.
Okay. 5,
no. Oh, 11.
6,
Beatrix there.
7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I got
12.
12. I got 12 both times.
And you got 11. Okay, so
I think it's 12. I think it's some of the
12. Okay, so we'll call that. Let's call it 11 because it was 2. 11's 1, 12. So 11 for the motion. This House believes the destruction of property is a valid form of protest. Let's move to the opposition vote. If you'd all raise your hand, do the emoji, message the chat. So we've got George.
Oh, Derek.
Sorry, I'm not voting against. I'm abstaining. Jamie.
Okay, all right. Okay.
So only 3. That's 4. Well, including Derek.
Yeah, that's 4.
All right, yeah.
That is 4. Okay. So that is 4 people against the motion. That means that the motion passes. This House believes that the destruction of property is a valid form of protest. Oh God. Wait for the Facebook comments. Well done, everybody. Okay. Before we go, we're going to announce next week's debate. So if I give Helen admin privileges, there you go. Make host. There you go. Helen, can you now share the thing, please?
One second. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Up the suspense.
Yeah, do a drum roll, everyone.
This House, as the University of Aberdeen, would fire George Boyne. This is in relation to the recent scandal where he travelled to the south of Wales from Aberdeen, and also with laws from the university regarding how students should stay inside and also obey with threat of expulsion. So the motion is this House, as the University of Aberdeen, would fire George Boyne. Thank you very much, Helen. Okay. Again, thank you all so much for showing up. We will be uploading this to the Facebook page and we can control the YouTube page. We'll do it there. Until then, thank you all so much, and we'll see you either at training with Maxwell on Tuesday and on Thursday, or next week. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.